certain that you all are quite excited as I am about this evening's lecture, which will be delivered by our distinguished guest, Mr. Leo Bernardo, on the thought-provoking, heart-pumping topic, Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean. A topic, you may note, is in line with St. Lucia's 2018-2019 budget theme, Building Resilience Today to Secure Our Future. This only signifies the importance and relevance of this evening's lecture as we look towards building a St. Lucia which is more economically resilient.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening to yet another Open Campus St. Lucia event in celebration of the UWI's 70th year of service and leadership to the region. Indeed, for the Open Campus, it is actually a dual celebration, as we are also celebrating a significant milestone, that of 10 years as the online arm of the University of the West Indies. I extend a very warm and special welcome to Mr. Bernardo and thank him for graciously accepting our invitation to address us this evening. Your topic, Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean, could not be more timely and fits perfectly with the UWI's 2017-2022 strategic plan, which focuses on developing strategic initiatives to assist in the revitalization of the Caribbean's economic growth and development, leading to the improved well-being of its people. So to get us off to a rousing start, let us take a few minutes to listen to a message from the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, on the occasion of the UWI's 70th anniversary milestone, after which we will move into the main event. I thank you.
This University of the West Indies, our University of the West Indies, which we love and care for, has reached its 70th year of service to the people of the West Indies, the Greater Caribbean, and the world beyond. We all know the circumstances surrounding its origins, beginning in the 1940s with the popular revolt against colonization and the rise of the democracy movement. Our university came into being in 1948. Since then, it has given 70 years of distinguished and excellent service to this region. We all know that the process of nation building, the collapse of colonies across the West Indies and the emergence of sustainable nations, all of that was made possible because of the investments that were made in the University of the West Indies. The regional integration movement, the UWI, has been the spine, the backbone of this movement for regional integration, not only in terms of the gathering of the finest minds in this region, but also the creation of discussions, the creation of the institutions, the movement of the intellectual community, of students, of administrators. All of that has been made possible because of the University of the West Indies. And it has been involved in all the areas of civic engagement. Discussions about economic growth, discussions about social justice, about cultural integrity, about the liberation of the imagination of Caribbean young peoples. All of these conversations have been a part of the journey of the UWI. It is not only a distinguished regional university, it is a university that has acquired a global brand, respected all over the world for the excellence of its students, its professors, its administration. Indeed, UWI is a site of excellence. Excellence in scholarship, the excellence of the people of the Caribbean. And every household across this region, and every island, and every country, the UWI, the debates, its impact has been felt. 4 campuses, 1 university. But now we have gone into the global world in a different way. We now have a center with our colleagues at the State University of New York, the UWI SUNY Institute for Leadership and Sustainable Development in New York. We have also engaged our colleagues at the University of Lagos. We now have a University of Lagos UWI Center for History and Culture. We are seeking to establish a similar institute in Suzhou in China, where we have established with our colleagues in Suzhou a center for software engineering. But in this 70th year, we will celebrate. We will celebrate our graduates, our alumni all over the world and the region, our students, our faculty, our administrators, our governments, our investors in the private sector, all of our participants to this journey to excellence will be celebrated in this 70th year. But it's also a time not only for reflection, but for projection, looking into the future, looking into the next 20 to 50 years. And we have started in earnest. Our new strategic plan, 5-year strategic plan, 2017-2022, is entitled the AAA Strategy, because we will seek to be more accessible to the people of the region. We will seek to align this university even more effectively with the stakeholders of this region. And we will seek also to be more agile and seeking out opportunities to expand and to develop this university. But we are all faced in this region with this crippling economic crisis that is before us. And for this reason, our strategic plan is subtitled Rekindling Caribbean Economic Development. We need to generate more wealth in this region. We need to redistribute this wealth more equitably. The economic transformation of this region is critical to the future of our university. So as we speak about economic growth and the emphasis our university will place on economic transformation, we will also speak simultaneously about social justice. These have been our traditional objectives. And so our 70th year will be a time of celebration of the magnificence of this enterprise we call the University of the West Indies, this regional effort, this regional mobilization. But it will also be a time for us to look into the future and to speak about the journey ahead. In this regard, as Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies, I celebrate each and every one of you, and we look forward to working even more closely with you as we project the future, our future, the future of Caribbean peoples. I thank you.
The perennial challenge that has confronted most of our region for some time, since for much of the 20th century and to the present, relates to the challenge of achieving or sustaining robust levels of economic growth as necessary, albeit a necessary but not sufficient condition to help us achieve our ultimate goal of economic and social development, which would be reflected in higher levels or standards and quality of living of the people of the region. So growth is a means to an end. Indeed, this challenge has consumed the attention and minds of many of our people, our luminaries and scholars for some time, as well as our governments. Even our Sir William Arthur Lewis, who has certainly contributed to this debate, has been one of the individuals who has given much attention to this elusive goal. As many of you may know, no doubt, the region, I speak here of the entire Caribbean, has for the last couple decades been caught in a so-called growth trap, for want of a better word, in terms of lower growth levels that are below desirable levels to make meaningful inroads in confronting the social challenges, including the noble principle of distributive justice, which was just alluded to by our Vice Chancellor. the whole idea of dealing with poverty, raising our infrastructure, increasing our competitiveness, and all the things that flow from higher levels of output. Since independence, St. Lucia, like many other developing countries, have become members of the IMF. And the IMF, under the Article 4 arrangements, which involves the monitoring and surveillance requirements, has been providing us with an assessment of our economies in terms of how they've been performing year on year for some time. They have been a friend and sometimes misunderstood by many. Nonetheless, the IMF continues to be with us. And today, I have the pleasure of saying just a few words to you to introduce our guest speaker, who, as you've heard, is Mr. Leo Bernardo, who would speak to us on the subject, Unleashing Growth and Strengthening Resilience in the Caribbean. Mr. Leo Bernardo is the Deputy Division Chief of the Caribbean 1 Division of the IMF, which includes the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, countries that make up that grouping, which is essentially, for the most part, OECS countries. He has been Mission Chief for St. Lucia since 2015 and led the 2017 ECHO Regional Consultation. Mr. Bernardo has been with the IMF since 2000, where he worked on several countries, including Armenia, Croatia, Georgia, Iran, Lithuania, Norway, Pakistan, Sweden, Uzbekistan, and among others. Before joining the IMF, Mr. Bernardo served as head of international economics at the Reserve Bank of New Zealand from 1995 to 1999. Prior to that, he was head of macroeconomics at Banca Commerciale Italiana in Italy. He holds a Master of Arts in Economics from Boston University and a Master of Arts in Economics from the University of Modena in Italy. He has published numerous articles in books and economic journals, as is typical of the IMF. Tonight, he will speak to us, yes. Tonight, he'll speak to us really about the Caribbean, the story of the Caribbean, and perhaps not in any chronological order, but more or less giving us some perspective regarding the factors and policies that would have contributed to shaping the outcomes in terms of economic performance of the region over the last few decades, and would offer some suggestions perhaps as to how we might go forward. With these few words, I'd like to introduce you to our guest speaker, Mr. Leo Bernardo.
I'm very glad to be here. I'm really honored with this opportunity. I think to celebrate such an important anniversary of your university, and to celebrate also the role of education in the social life, in the economic life, is a great privilege. And what a better place to celebrate that than St. Lucia, that has given 2 Nobel Prizes to the world. Actually, I looked at the numbers before coming here. St. Lucia, of the 189 members of the fund, is the country with the highest number of Nobel Prizes per capita. So congratulations to you on this. Now, the University of West Indies is obviously a very important institution in the region. The introduction that you saw before is certainly testimony to that. I also know the good quality of this institution, because I have many colleagues who graduated from University of West Indies, and I know how good they are and how I appreciate working with them. For me, I mean, the name also, West Indies, is a beautiful name, and it's very evocative. It's an ancient name in a sense, and well, it evokes many things. One of the things that it evokes is cricket to me. You will think, wow, West Indies, the team is known all over the world, and to me is also an example of something that a region or a nation of small countries should do. Get their forces together, put champions from different countries together, and create a team that is competitive globally. That is what, in many ways, the Caribbean should do also as countries and as economies. And the cost of not doing that, I know there are difficulties in doing that of different sorts, political, cultural, but the reality is that these countries are very similar, and the similarities far exceed the differences. And the cost of not exploiting these similarities, I think, is way too high to not consider. So in many things, including, economics, you have the political organizations, but I think more can be done in that regard. So in a sense, that's one of the things I wanted to mention. You probably wonder why this guy with an Italian-sounding name is talking about cricket. And you have good reasons for that, because in fact, I was raised at bread and soccer, or maybe pasta and soccer, or football, the way you want to call it. But as you heard from Dr. Samuel, at some point in my life I moved to New Zealand, so I learned to appreciate some of the subtleties of a game that can last 5 days and end with no winners, and the exquisite tactics of declare. So I've learned a bit, but it's true. It's not really my field. This book, of which unfortunately I'm not an author, but it's been authored by many other colleagues of mine and other colleagues of other institutions as well, because growth and resilience are both complex phenomena, and they cannot be reduced to just simple factors. The IMF, some people, it's a relatively narrow focus. It's the macroeconomy and the stability of the macroeconomy. And so we don't know much about, things that are related to growth, like education, crime, how do you build resilience to natural disasters, climate change. But of course, they're all related, and they all end up in affecting the economic developments in a country like yours in particular. And so we have a collaboration from other colleagues from international financial institutions like the IDB. This book, it depends, maybe at the end of the lecture, if you want to know more, it can be downloaded free of charge from the IMF website. Of course, if I say it's an interesting book, I'm not an impartial observer, but consider that. Now, as I said, the role of education is critical in growth, and I'm very glad that how some of the premises of this book is, again, there is no silver bullet for growth. There are many things that need to be looked at once, part of the society, part of the economy, and again, exposure to natural disaster, important thing. But education is certainly one key element. And in the region, we know that education-related things are weaknesses that can be addressed. We hear a lot of skill mismatches, of lack of human capital. There is a scarcity of human capital relative to demand, but particularly of brain drain. If you look at the Caribbean, there are the ones that emigrate from the Caribbean and go to the US, for example. These are all highly educated people. If you compare them with Mexico, for example, there is no comparison. These are all highly skilled, and they're probably having a successful career in other countries, and they are a loss to the country. Maybe it's unavoidable to some extent because the salary that you can get in the US, it's very difficult to find something that you can match here. But still, salary is one part of the attractiveness of work condition. There are others. The subheading of the AAA strategy of your university is revitalizing Caribbean development. And so that's very much also in the spirit of what the book is trying to look at. And as I said, education, wealth creation and reduction of social inequality to greater and more affordable access to education is certainly a key element of a strategy of economic growth. Now, there is a lot of information in this graph, and so I'm going to try to guide you through it because it's a little bit complicated, but this is just to say a snapshot of the important achievements that the Caribbean society, region as a whole, has made. So the red ball that you see there is the median value for all the Caribbean countries. The black ball is the median value for emerging markets and developing economies to which the Caribbean can compare. That line that you see there with the two bars is the so-called interquartile range. And basically what that means, it's a measure of how wide is the distribution. Say, if you order all the countries, say in increasing order, those two bars identify the country that is at 1/4 of the distribution and the country that is at the third quarter of the distribution. So going down the line. Meaning, for example, that is there? Yes. So this here means that's the country for the emerging markets and developing economies that is at about 75%. So what does this mean? The Caribbean are much higher, not only of the median of the emerging developing markets in terms of GDP per capita, but they're also higher than a country that is quite high in the distribution of emerging markets and developing economies. Life expectancy is also higher than the median, although not, it's a little bit lower than the 75%. Infant mortality rate is a little bit lower. Other, like female participation rate, is also higher than the median. And voice and accountability, which is measured by democratic institution in the society, the ability of expressing your opinion freely and having an arena in which you can influence the public decision. So on all these aspects, the Caribbean look pretty good. These data are about 2015 or so. And they sort of mark the progress that has been made in this region over time. The issue maybe on which one has to point his or her attention is what happened in the last 20 years, though. Again, oops. Here you have 3 lines. The blue line is the Caribbean countries that are more based on tourism, like St. Lucia. The red line is the Caribbean countries that are more based on commodity producers like Trinidad and Tobago. And the middle light is the group of reference that I was talking about before, emerging markets and developing economy. You see, emerging markets and developing economy have continued growing after 2000 at pretty good rates. This is real GDP, and this is GDP per capita. So it controls also for changes in population. Now, you can see here that economies like St. Lucia have actually slowed down significantly since 2000. This is even more clear if we look at GDP per capita, which slows down significantly since early 2000. And the last chart on the right inside, this blue line. So here you have real GDP growth. It's the average of the decade. And here you have the GDP per capita relative to the US. So as long as we're moving along this line towards the right, it shows that Caribbeans are catching up with the US. They are converging, as the economists say, to the income of the US. Now, this convergence has continued since we started in 1970, 1980s, 1990s, and then after 2000, the convergence has stopped, has actually receded. So, obviously, this is a very important, what Mr. Samuel called the crisis that we are facing. In a sense, it is a crisis because although the economies are growing, the pace of progress is not the same as it used to be. So it's very important to understand what the reasons are, so to address them, so as to be able to address them correctly. And as I said at the beginning, there are many, I don't think this can be reduced to any single factor, that there are many structural impediments that are listed here on the left-hand side. Natural disasters is one of them, violent crime, brain drain, high costs of doing business, the loss of preferential trade access that happened in many production. For St. Lucia, I think it was in the 1990s for the banana production. And also the loss of official development assistance, because many of these countries are relatively high GDP per capita, so they graduated, as they say, from and they become not eligible for concessional finance. There are macroeconomic impediments. All these countries in general in the Caribbean tend to have a weak fiscal position and elevated levels of public debt, which are a drain on growth. They have high non-performing loans. Non-performing loans, I don't know if you are familiar with this word, but basically means bad loans, loans that the banks are not able to recover, loans that are not being paid or on which the principal is not being paid for some reason. So they are a sign, an indicator of the health of the banking system. If you have high non-performing loans as a bank, you're probably not going to lend much more. First, because your standards are going to be tightened, your lending standards are going to be tightened, but also because you don't have the capital, because the capital to lend more, because the capital is blocked by this, to make provisions for these high non-performing loans. And then another aspect of the financial sector that is important, and in particular in St. Lucia, but also in other countries, is the financial sector is relatively shallow, and inclusion measured as ability to access credit. St. Lucia is one of the countries where businesses declare access to credit as one of the major obstacles for their businesses. So all these elements, I think they reinforce themselves to form something, some of these elements were there before. Some have been reinforced over the years, and particularly in the last 20 years. And I think all of these things together probably are an explanation for the declining growth that we have seen. So I go through some of these elements to give you some information and show some of the background that might be useful to understand the importance of the different factors. The chart on the left-hand side shows natural disasters between 1950 and 2014. So that's the number of disasters per 1,000 square kilometers. you see on the red line shows the world average. If you look above that line, many, or if not most of these countries are Caribbean countries. So that gives you a sense of how important and how exposed to natural disasters the Caribbean are. The other element that makes natural disasters so important is that a natural disaster for a big nation may not be so important for in the overall, economy. Say a disaster as big as Katrina in the US was relatively negligible given the size of the economy. But for small countries, small islands in particular, a disaster can be, twice as much the size of the economy, 3 times as much the size of the economy, can be absolutely devastating. Just look at these figures here on the right-hand side to give you a sense. This light blue bar shows other states, meaning medium and size and large size states. And it shows the damages, average damages from natural disasters as a percentage of GDP, so measured relative to the size of the economy. This is what for other states is below 0.5%. For small states, this goes up to something in between 1.5 to 2% of GDP. So it's 3 times as much or more. You can see that the macroeconomic relevance of this element changes substantially. And then if we look at the Caribbean, that's even higher because we go between 2 and 2.5%. And for the small islands of the ECCU, right in the corridor of the Atlantic hurricane belt, it goes as high as 3.5% of GDP. High debt. Why is high debt important? The connection with growth is very easy to establish. When you have high public debt and you want to borrow, you tend to spend more because investors are afraid that you will not be able to repay. Not only that, if you pay interest on that debt, that is going to eat up a lot of your resources that could be devoted to other programs that have an impact on the economy, socially, or impact on growth. So, and the other thing is also that when you're hit by a natural disaster, you have less money to spend because you haven't saved in the good days and you have all that debt to repay. So, the chart on the left-hand side showed the evolution of government debt over the years. You see, compared with Caribbean is the blue line, and then you have non-Caribbean small states, which is this dashed line here. And the non-Caribbean ED, emerging markets and developing states, are this light blue line. If you see these 3 groups, the public debt in these 3 groups have moved in a relatively similar way up to 2000. After that, the Caribbean public debt jumps up. And here you can see, at least for countries, the situation in 2016. The blue part is the domestic debt, the red part is the foreign debt. This line here shows the median for the emerging markets and developing economies. Many of the Caribbean countries, including St. Lucia, including other ECCU countries, are well above that median. And this is just gives an idea of what the illustrative adjustment to reach the 60% debt ratio in 10 years from now. So having high debt has also the bad side of having to repay that debt, and to repay that debt you either have to increase taxes or to reduce spending. Of course, you can also grow out of it and you can pay for lower interest rates. But all these things are linked together. And it's very difficult to do something without some sort of fiscal adjustment. Then there are many what we call structural constraints. On the left-hand side, you see the World Bank produces an index that is called the doing business indicator, which is supposed to measure how easy it is to do business in several aspects. It can be in access to credit or the time that it takes to complete a certain procedure, to get a license to build, things like that. The chart here shows the association between this index, the ranking in this index, and GDP per capita. As you can imagine, the richest countries tend to have a better ranking. That's kind of obvious. They have also the resources to provide good conditions for business. This line here is the regression line, shows sort of the average. Of all the Caribbean countries, only Jamaica is below that line, showing that only Jamaica has relatively favorable business conditions. All the other Caribbean countries are above that line. This heat map on the right-hand side collects a lot of data from different sources on different aspects, and it's a heat map because it tries to identify where the problems are. The problems are where you see the red. The relatively favorable situation is where you see the green. And of course, the yellow is something in between. So I don't know if you can read, but I'll go maybe through these factors for you. So violent crime. The group to which St. Lucia belongs is the tourism-intensive Caribbean economist, the leftmost column here. So violent crime, immigration, skilled immigration, human capital, natural disasters, government debt, taxation, NPLs are the non-performing loans that we talked about before, ease of doing business, competitiveness, bureaucracy, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption, trade openness, trade tariffs, trade connectivity, participation through the global value chain, that is how much the countries are integrated in production of goods across different countries. High-tech export share and export diversification. You see the areas that are identified in red are immigration, skilled migration, natural disasters, government debt, NPLs, trade tariffs. These are sort of the critical area to give you an idea. Energy costs are one critical aspect. The electricity in the Caribbean is very, very expensive, and the prices are also tend to be quite volatile. You see here the US, what you pay in the US, and here is the median of what you pay in the Caribbean over the years. The latest you have is 2012, with a high that is actually higher than that. And on the right-hand side, you have the share of firms that in the World Bank Enterprise Survey said that they are constrained in their business by electricity costs. And again, it's correlated with GDP per capita, so it shows that above this line, for a given GDP per capita, you expect the countries that are above this line to have more problems with electricity in terms of doing business. And you see all familiar names are up here. I don't know if St. Lucia is LCA, if you, it's right, so it's right up here. Another big important aspect for St. Lucia and for the Caribbean in general, for St. Lucia, is access to finance, which is a big problem for SMEs, small and medium-sized enterprises. If you see here on the left-hand side, you can see that this problem is particularly high in St. Lucia, Dominica, and Belize, that they are well above the average for LAC, which is the Latin America, Caribbean region. And to go to some of the components, loan deposit spreads is the difference between how much you pay when you borrow and how much you get on your savings deposit. And if the spread is very large, it means that there are intermediation inefficiencies, and also it's a sign of lack of financial inclusion, because people are obliged to pay a very high rate when they borrow, and they get a relatively low rate on when they save. You see that this it's a problem in Jamaica. It's striking, but it's a problem almost everywhere, including St. Lucia. On the collateral needed as a percentage of a loan, it's a very high number. In Jamaica, you need 188% of the loan in collateral to get a loan. In St. Lucia, that number is about 167 or so. But it's a big, big number. Let's move to crime. Not a pleasant subject, but I mean, it needs to be dealt with and looked at this, because it certainly has certainly an important impact on growth. Again, the usual, crime here is measured as the homicide rate. And there's the correlation with GDP per capita. I mean, it's true that homicide rates tend to be lower in richer society. There is some correlation to some extent. But say for a given level of income, you can see that the Caribbean countries are up there. They're not comparable to this, which are El Salvador, Honduras, which are the most dangerous places in the world. But still, Jamaica obviously is well known that crime is a problem there. St. Lucia is sort of the midway. Now, the Inter-American Development Bank estimate that the costs that are related to crime, can be as high as 4.7% of GDP in the Bahamas. And some of those costs are public, the government bears this cost. Some are borne by the private sector, and some are borne by the society as a whole. So brain drain is a phenomenon that, as I said, in the Caribbean is very strong, because the immigration tends to be mostly of skilled people, and it's a loss for the country. But it also has a positive side, that people who live abroad send remittances, and they send them particularly at moments in which they are needed. There's been a natural disaster, you need some money from your family to help you rebuild or fix something. Someone who lives abroad and that their capacity to assist you, it's a very useful resource. So one has to look at what's the net effect of this on growth, because you are deprived of skilled people who contribute to, production and to contribute to the society. But you also have the other positive side. I think looking at both, the brain drain is so intense in the Caribbean, and you can see from this chart here, all the Caribbean countries are clustered up in the well above that sort of line, that the regression line. The brain drain is so important that probably, this is an estimate, but the impact is likely to be mostly negative, because the negative effect of having these highly skilled people abroad more than compensate for the positive effect of the remittances from these people. Now, competitiveness is a very important issue, and of course, Caribbean countries compete at the global level. And for countries like St. Lucia, where tourism is so important, it's also important to be, to keep competitive, to maintain or increase your share in the global market. But this line here shows the market share of the Caribbean in tourism, the total arrivals all over the world globally. And so this is the share of the Caribbean. The share of the Caribbean has declined. See, it starts here in 95, has declined over time. Then there are some little blips, but overall, as you can see, the trend is a declining trend. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean, it means that there are new competitors also that come in the market, some Asia, for example. There are many countries that have been competing. But it's something of a worry, because the Caribbean used to have a much larger share of global tourism than they have now. So it can also indicate that there is an emerging competitiveness problem there. On the right-hand side, I think this is an interesting index that some colleague of mine produced. It's called Week at the Beach Index. It's supposed to represent the cost of 1 week at the beach in different countries in the world. So say it's the cost of 1 week at a hotel. I think it's between 3 and 5 stars. The cost of a taxi ride, the cost of a restaurant, going out to dinner, the cost of a beer on the beach, things like that. I don't remember the exact composition, but so if you know, I don't know how many of you know the Big Mac. So what McDonald's, based on the Big Mac that you buy from McDonald's, right? It's exactly the same product, and you can find it all over the world. So using the Big Mac price, it's a very good indication of how a country can be competitive relative to others. This tries to do the same. It's much more difficult because it's not an homogeneous product. A week at the beach in St. Lucia is not the same thing as a week at the beach in the Dominican Republic. But in any case, gives you an indication. And if you look at this picture, you can see that the Caribbean are unfortunately on the most expensive side compared with the Americas, Europe, Asia, Africa. So this 100, I think, is the price of a week in the Bahamas. St. Lucia, I think, is about the same, or a little bit higher. But as you can see, this is very high compared with the average of the other regions. It's sort of in general, if you go to a travel agent, they say, well, Caribbeans are pretty expensive. And and this is shown in an index that it sort of makes sense. So maybe looking at how we can get out of this difficult situation, and how we can go back to a period in which the Caribbean were growing and were converging to the US income. Energy, I think, is a key element. And of course, the starting point, well, if you compare the Caribbean as a whole with the world, this is the composition of energy in the world. Say, petroleum products are this blue component. This red component is natural gas. This is coal. The green one is renewables. And then you have nuclear. Now, the composition of energy in the Caribbean, I mean, it's nice to have a higher share of renewables than the global, But as you can see, it's still heavily dependent on petroleum products. So shifting to renewables is an imperative. It's very important. And many governments are looking at this, as, including St. Lucia. And Jamaica has made in very fast progress in the last 2-3 years, and this very ambitious objective to reach at 30% of renewables by 2019. I think that also loosening financial constraint is very important, and in particular in St. Lucia, that where the problem is clearly significant. These are just the result of a model simulation, but I just want to give you an idea. On the left-hand side, this shows the overall cumulative effect over a certain number of years, like 10 years, on GDP, of eliminating constraints, say, to participation, reducing the spreads to zero, to almost zero, reducing the collateral requirements to the best 10% of countries. And then the red bar, portion of the bar, shows when you put all these three policies together, you have an additional effect that comes just for the fact that you have implemented them all. So these are very significant effects. Again, it's a model simulation, but it's just to give you an idea of how important it could be. And it also has a positive effect on income distribution, because particularly in terms of the participation, you would have some positive impact on Gini coefficient, which is the coefficient that shows the concentration of income. It's a measure of income distribution. Now, to reduce crime, again, as I told you, these are things that we have looked at, but we are not experts on this, so we benefited from the advice of other experts on this from other financial institutions. Three-pronged approach, prevention and deterrence, and there are a number of things that can be done, like programs for parenting and monitoring, urban renewal. It's an important part of reducing crime. It's very evident in areas that are of cities where there's been some deterioration in certain areas, and there, in those areas, you see crime increasing. There is a part that, of course, relates to enforcement and detection. And so there are data sharing and collection, measures more targeted, and rigorous evaluation of approaches. And of course, there is a rehabilitation part as well, reintegrate people in the society and giving adequate opportunities to find jobs and being retrained. All these are very important programs and are being considered by all Caribbean countries. Now, building resilience to natural disaster has many meanings. Certainly, one meaning is to have financial resilience, so that when disasters happen, you have the money set aside to intervene immediately, and not only for the urgent situation for relief purposes, but also to start financing the reconstruction as quickly as possible. And for a third reason, which is to prevent public debt from going up again, because we have seen sequences of disasters and then public debt goes up, and it's very difficult to bring it back down. Again, this is a sort of a background. The average annual effects of natural disasters, the blue bar shows the damage as a percentage of GDP. The yellow bar shows the percentage of the population that are affected by natural disasters. And the diamond shows the frequency of disasters. And this is, again, is a comparison between other states for which all these indicators are pretty modest, compared with small states, and then compared with the Caribbean. On the right-hand side, you see this is some work that the World Bank did in 2013 that shows the return of certain intervention that you can make to prepare or prevent. And certainly the ones that are on which Caribbean countries are most interested in are earthquake, floods, tropical storms. Now, this dashed red line shows you where the break-even point. So for all this intervention, it shows that there is quite a substantial payoff in intervening to prevent or to prepare. So I think this means also a cultural shift, going from all the official assistance tends to be based on intervention ex post. So the disaster happens, everybody sees that on TV, and so they start collecting money and the government start providing that money. But it's a very inefficient way to do it, because often you have conflicting, you have teams that come to provide relief. They're not particularly well organized and maybe they're not ready. There are too many. The money comes, but it's not quick enough to provide relief that is necessary. And it's not, and the damage that this system produces is so large that, as shown by this picture, that shifting completely to a framework in which you see that disasters are going to happen. The question is only when. And so you prepare adequately for that in terms of, I mean, I know you have very good agencies that look after the relief and the coordination in the region for relief. Say, prepare fiscal buffers that are adequate to face the effect of these disasters and to provide the resources that are necessary at that time, that are going to be much more efficient than ex post disaster money. And the donors also should consider this. Of course, it pays much more to be seen as providing relief after the disaster has occurred. But providing relief, providing money to help these countries prepare for this doesn't provide as much resonance on the media, on the political level. But it's much more effective, and so there has to be a shift. I'm almost finished. I just wanted to show you this. This is what my colleagues did here. It was trying to synthesize all these different elements in what are the most critical factors for each country. In technical terms, they ran a regression, and using measurements of all these different factors, they showed how much a country could gain by dealing with all these different aspects. And as you can see, some countries have really very large gains of above 2% of GDP by dealing with means reducing to, I think it's, I don't remember exactly which level, but dealing with the brain drain, dealing with the fiscal problem, having a greater ease of doing business, some of the structural, so improving the business climate, having more trade integration, having lower crime, having lower disaster damage. Since we are in St. Lucia, St. Lucia is not one of the countries that would have most benefit, but you can see the critical areas are certainly, there is crime, there is debt, there is there is greater human capital, right? So, other countries have been more affected by natural disaster than St. Lucia, I guess. So, in terms of the conclusion, I have to go back to what I said at the beginning. There is no silver bullet. It's a complex phenomenon. And from our perspective, our mandate at the IMF is macro stability. So we're all, you know, some people say IMF means it's mostly fiscal, because to say that our focus is so narrow. But it's partly true. We also try to broaden our perspective and look at different aspects that are macroeconomic relevant. And there are so many of them. Certainly natural disasters are one for St. Lucia. So macro stability, which is our main concern, is just a necessary condition, but certainly is not sufficient to resolve this problem. Of course, you can have strong fiscal buffers. That's going to help you. You can strengthen you can have a more sustainable debt situation, and so you can improve, so you can pay less on interest, you can have more money to spend on good government programs. And you can have structural reforms that release some of the constraints to doing business that are so pronounced. But of course, there are so many other things, and some of them are so important, like, as I mentioned, energy cost, financial inclusion, education, crime, and particularly in this region, strengthen resilience to natural disaster. Thank you for your attention, and thank you.
On behalf of the organizers and those who have participated in the event here tonight, we wish to thank you, Mr. Leo Bernardo, our featured speaker, for your insightful lecture and sharing your knowledge with us. Please relay our gratitude to the IMF Caribbean Division for supporting our request for tonight's lecture. I assure you that your presentation will not remain within these walls, but will be shared via TV and social media platforms that a much wider audience can benefit from your insights. To Dr. Thomas Samuel, we say thank you for agreeing to introduce Mr. Bonato and for moderating the post-lecture discussion on such short notice. Of course, it's important to note that he's a very staunch supporter of the UWI, whether playing dominoes at our games night or lending us his professional expertise. He's very faithful in that regard. To the local president of the UWI Alumni Association, Ms. Lydia Daria, for stepping in and chairing the ceremony on such short notice, we say a hearty thank you. Members of the alumni and guild executives, we say thank you for your support. We cannot forget the hardworking staff of the UWI Open Campus St. Lucia for your dedication and assistance with the organization of this lecture. To our friends in the media, we appreciate your assistance, especially for the pre-lecture dissemination of information, which contributed to the turnout tonight. Last but by no means least, our wonderful audience, we say thank you very much for attending tonight. Please note that we appreciate you, and the events that we host are successful because of you. We look forward to seeing you and welcoming you to our future events as we celebrate 70 years of service, 70 years of leadership in our anniversary year. Once again, thank you.